I want to introduce our guest, Professor Martina Morris, who is here to help us answer the question, is crime rising in Washington? Professor Morris is a professor emerita from UW with a dual appointments from the, I want to say, Sociology and Statistics departments.
That's right.
And she's here to help us look through the data, not just to look at the data, but also to help us learn to interpret it for ourselves, learn where to find these things, and just sort of upfront, all the data that we're going to be working with is data that's available to everybody and data that's being provided by our local law enforcement. So no special numbers, just the same public numbers that everybody gets. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Professor Morris. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'll say a couple things. I'm also a member of a community advocacy organization over here called Next Steps Washington that was started by the Thomas family. Their son was murdered by the Lakewood police in 2013. And they have been fighting ever since, which is a long time to be fighting. And I'm also a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. They are a statewide coalition that's been working really hard for all the legislation that you've probably heard about, changing the laws and legislation around police reform and accountability in Washington state. I'm going to apologize for the frog in my throat. I don't know how I got there, but it's there for the duration, unfortunately. So a little bit of an introduction here. What you are looking at is an online report that I put together that uses official state and jurisdiction information on crime rates in Washington state and breaks them down in ways that are hopefully useful for community. I'm giving this whole presentation just by, I'm going to be taking you various places on the web, because the bottom line here is all of this stuff is available to you if you know where to look for it. And it's empowering to sort of realize that. And I'll have to say, in some ways, I probably spent a good 4 months listening to various people claiming that crime was skyrocketing here in Washington state before I finally sat down and thought to myself, wait a minute, let me go actually look and see if that's true. If you hear enough people say the same thing over and over again, there's a sort of sense of, well, it must be true if everybody's saying it. And so it was stunning to me when I actually sat down and started to look at the numbers and I realized, oh my gosh, this isn't true at all. So hopefully you will come away from this with the same feeling and empowered to go look for this stuff yourself and be able to figure out whether people are, what people's claims are accurate or not. All right, so I'm going to start right in with the data, and then I will come back and talk a little bit about where it comes from and what you need to know about it. And so I'm going to start with a general sort of trend plot. This is something that everybody kind of knows how to interpret. And I'll do a little didactic stuff here is because I'm a teacher. Notice first what the dates are. So whenever you're going to look at data, first thing to look at is, you know, what are the parameters we're talking about here? Note that this ends in 2020. It doesn't end in 2021. We are currently in 2022, and the claims that most people are talking about is 2021. So that should be your first clue that, how come 2021 isn't in here? Hold that thought. All right, so what we are looking at here is crime rates. Rates per 1,000 persons. The data come from, so it says up here, the Washington State, this is the Office of Financial Management. And the data come from a data collection program called the National Incident-Based Reporting System that feeds into what's called the Uniform Crime Reports at the national level. So states voluntarily participate in this program, but Washington State does participate. And what that means is they collect data and then they publish it pretty much every year. And there's lots of information in these data. I'll show you a little bit of it here. And so this is the plot for what's going on with crime rates per 1,000 people. So that accounts for any population changes over this 8-year period from 2012 to 2020. So if you look at it, you'll see there are 4 lines. The top line is the total crime rate per 1,000. And then the next 3 lines are basically the breakdown of the total into the 3 traditional categories that people use in this area: property crime, crimes against persons, which are all violent crimes. At least all violent crimes are in there. Not all of person crimes are violent, but all violent crime is in the person category. Property crimes are things like burglaries and arson, things that have influenced property only, but a person is not directly the victim of the crime. And then society crimes are sort of a grab bag of things like weapons violations, drug crimes, commercial sex, to the extent that that's criminalized. So what this plot shows you just overall is, number one, property crimes dominate. Okay, so everybody's very concerned about violent crime, which is in the person category, but property crime is far and away the largest category of crime. And then if you look at the trend, so let's say you're a journalist, how would you describe the trend, the overall trend? So that purple line, what's been happening to crime in Washington state? Think about that for a minute. Okay, so my takeaway, just looking at it right off the bat, is, seems to be going down, right? So the trend is, if you put a line through that top purple set of dots and points, you have a general downward trend in crime. So right off the bat, it's like, wait, that is like the opposite of what everybody's talking about. Okay. Then, however, there is this, you can see there is an uptick from 2019 to 2020. It's not that large, right? And this was the uptick that many of you probably remember back in July of last year. So last summer, there was a big news flash, crime is skyrocketing in Washington state, right? This is what they were talking about. It was 2020 data. And yes, there was a small uptick in crime. However, the other thing to realize about this, and this is what the headlines didn't say, is even with that uptick, crime rates in Washington state in 2020 were below the historic levels that we've seen here, right? So we were still below average. So that unfortunately doesn't make for good news. So, or at least a good headline. It's not clickbait. And so that's not what you saw. The second thing that you can see here very clearly is that uptick driven entirely by property crimes, right? Because if you look here, what you can see is that crimes against persons actually dropped a little bit, not a lot, but they didn't increase. And crimes against society also dropped. So the only reason there was an increase was there was an increase in property crime. So those are the 3 things that I take away from this plot. And they're all a little bit different than the sort of hand wringing that you hear in the headlines. So the other thing I want to show you is then, how do you think about these changes that you see from year to year? I mean, is this a big change? Is that a little change? Should we be worried about it? And for that, it's easiest, I think, to actually isolate the changes. And that's what I've done in this plot here. So you've got the crimes against person, against property, against society, and total. You've got along the x-axis here, the years. And what's being shown in the bars is the change, the percentage change in this particular type of crime. So this is a crimes against society. The change from 2012 to 2013 was there was a 22% drop. Then the next year, in 2014, it was minus 2%. You can't even see it, right? So there was almost no change at all. In 2015, it dropped by another 7%. And then you've got 2 years of increases, 12% and 11%. And then some very small ones, again, a 2% here And this one is so small, I can't even pick it, which is fine. But from 2019 to 2020, crimes against society dropped by 16%. So you can see for the total, society, remember society was fairly small number of crimes. I'll show you those again. They're hugging the bottom here, right? So there are not a lot of those going on. And if you look at the total, which has, that's the largest number, what I want you to take away from this is basically from year to year, you don't expect to get exactly the same number of crimes each year and exactly the same crime rate each year. You're going to get some year-to-year variation. So this shows you what typical year-to-year variation looks like. It goes up and down in no particular pattern. You don't see a long run where it's just increasing, 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 and no decreases in sight. And the increases and decreases roughly fall within, say, 10%, at least if you've got big numbers. If you've got small numbers, then these tend to be a little bit more volatile. So the other thing to notice about this, so there's a mix of increases and decreases, typically within plus or minus, say, 10 or 15%. So the bottom line is, if I see a 10% rise next year, I'm not going to get my knickers in a twist. That's typical year-to-year variation, right? If I see something much larger than that, then I'll start to think, hey, maybe there's something going on. Notice that the different crime types do not always rise and fall together. And we saw that even in 2020, property crimes rose by 14%, but crimes against persons fell by 4%, and crimes against society fell by 16%. Same year, different trend, right? So again, that's natural variation. No sustained periods of increase or decrease. And the pattern for the total here, as expected, is driven primarily by what's going on in property crimes, because property crimes account for about 3/4 of all crimes. So most of the changes you're going to see in the total crime rate are going to be coming from property crimes. All right.
Professor Morris?
Yes.
So I know you addressed this a little bit earlier about where the numbers are coming from. I just wondered if you could reiterate that and also just speak a little bit about how this is even calculated in the first place.
Okay. Before I do that, I want to show you one other thing, which is just a little bit of data on Spokane, and then I'll show you where the numbers come from. So I started here with the Washington state totals, and you now know what those look like. And then I can break them down by jurisdiction. And you can see here the tabs, there's Seattle, or you can look at King County, there's Tacoma or Pierce County, and then here's Spokane. Okay, so you can see the city of Spokane, or you can see the entire county of Spokane, and the trends are pretty similar, right? One thing that you can notice though is down in the bottom here, notice how the year starts in 2017. So before, the year started in 2012, and the reason it starts in 2017 for Spokane is because Spokane didn't start participating in this program completely until 2017. So that's when these data finally become available for Spokane. For many other jurisdictions in the state, they started in 2012, which was the beginning of that program. All right, so let's talk a little bit about data sources. There's a whole section here in this report on data sources. And the data that's going to be used in this report, you can see from the headlines here, I'm looking at 2012 to 2020. That's for the state as a whole, which is broken down then by jurisdictions. And then for 2021 here, we only have specific jurisdictions. And the reason for that is the data that I'm using in Washington state comes from this National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS. So imagine the process, and this is another big take-home message. Think about data as something that is produced. It's like a manufacturing process, right? So here are the raw materials. The raw materials are every law enforcement agency in the state. That's about 275 agencies, separate agencies. They are all collecting their own little information on these crimes. Then they send that off to something called the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. That's an organization in Washington state that's kind of unusual. Most states don't have an organization like this that basically serves as an umbrella for all of the law enforcement agencies. So WASPC gets monthly reports from each of the agencies. At the end of the year, they sort of bundle that up. They clean it a little bit, which basically means they look for errors in reporting and other things that they want to fix before sending it off to the FBI. And then once the FBI has it, they publish it. But it takes a long time for that process. So basically what happens is in Washington State, WASPC will report 4 months after the year is over. So if you want 2021 data, it will be available in April. Here we are in April of 2022, right? So here we are, we're in February of 2022, which means the Washington State data for 2021 is not yet available to the public. All right. So keep that in mind, because people who are running around saying there's this huge uptick in crime, either they're talking about a year ago, which was before the legislation in 2020, or what are they talking about? Because the state data aren't available yet. So the other place that the data are then made available, what WASPC does is they just give you a PDF report that they put up online, which is kind of useless for data analysis, right? Because they only give you what they're going to give you. It's 600 pages. So there's a good chance you'll find something you're interested in, right? But still, you can't manipulate it yourself. However, the data are actually the literal data themselves. Those are made available to the public as downloadable data sets. And that's done through 2 different agencies. The one that I think is most useful for us here in Washington State is through the Office of Financial Management. They have something called the Washington State Statistical Analysis Center. And they have this initiative called Access Washington that makes these data available to Washington residents. So you can download the data here from the data table. I'll just show you what that looks like. That is here. So this is the Washington State Statistical Analysis Center National Incident-Based Reporting System. So you can see, you can play with the data a little bit yourself online if you want, but if you look here, there's a data table. And from that data table, you can then, if you go down to the bottom of this, you can download, this is one way to download it, is here, for example. The other place that you can download it from, if you're interested, let me move this for a second. Just want to move this whole thing. Okay. The other place you can download it from, which is I think a little bit easier, is here. So this is, again, the SAC, which is the Statistical Analysis Center for the Office of Financial Management in Washington State. You can download either as a SAS data set for those of you who are interested or know how to work in the statistical package SAS. They've already, that's a nice thing for them to do. Otherwise, you can just download it as Excel. That's what I do because I use a different package for analyzing it. Jack, are you interested in seeing how I actually analyze it? Is that part of what you're asking about? Or I can give you just a very quick look at it, what the package looks like.
Like the quickest of overviews, and then if you have more like local specific data, we'd love to look at that too. Okay,
just quickest of overviews. This is what I work with, right? So you can actually see, here's going to be some of the things that I show you. This is what the code looks like. This is a package called R. I think the only reason I want to talk to you about it for this one, well, half a minute, is R is free. It costs you nothing. SAS will cost you $800 to buy, right? R is free. And there's a huge, it's also open source. There's a huge community of people that contribute to writing packages that allow you to analyze the data. I rely on a lot of that stuff while I'm doing this. And it allows you then, it gives you access to this whole publishing site, which is in fact where this crime rate data is that I've published for you. So you'll notice that the beginning of the URL for this is called RPubs. This is because these are publications from the R package, basically, and that's free. I don't pay anything for this, and you don't pay anything to get access to it. So this is part of a whole movement in academics now called reproducible, transparent research, which is trying to make data analysis more accessible to people. All right. So I would encourage you to take a look at the data sources. What you'll see here for the county NIBRS participation statistics. Remember, I told you not every county joined at the same time. So let's actually take a look. You can see there's a table here. You can, in this table online, you can look for Spokane. Okay, and what do you see? Well, in 2012, out of all the agencies in Spokane, and there are 7 of them in total, only 4 of them were participating in 2012, right? By 2020, 7 were participating, so that's all of them. And the last agency joined in 2016, which is why the data series starts in 2017, because that's when we have complete data for Spokane, okay? So that's how you use some of the information here. All right, so in terms of the trends, the thing that I want to show you by jurisdiction is you can talk about Washington State as a whole, but look what happens if you focus instead. So here's Seattle, and you can see the same trends, right? That looks different than what we saw in Washington, right? As a whole. This is Tacoma, looks different than Seattle. Spokane looks a little bit like Tacoma sort of at the end, because keep in mind, you're only talking about 2017 on, but look at Vancouver, totally different, right? So why is this important? From a policy perspective, if people say crime rates are skyrocketing in Washington State, but it turns out it's only 1 or 2 places that you're seeing that, you may not need statewide rollback of reforms to address that, right? So that's actually, I think, a key part of why we feel we don't need a statewide rollback of reforms, because you're not seeing crime rise everywhere. All right. So now you understand why we don't have statewide data for 2021. But there are some jurisdictions, they tend to be the larger jurisdictions, that make their data accessible online to folks. And they do this typically, well, they can do it in a number of different formats, and I'll show you what those formats are. So for the specific jurisdictions here, I found 5. There may be more in Washington State, but I wasn't going to look at every single county. There are 39 counties. I wasn't going to look at every single city. I don't think a lot of places do this. I think it's only the larger ones that can afford to. So in King County, we don't have, normally it would be the sheriff's office that would produce the data for folks, because they're the county level organization. But in King County, that doesn't happen. Instead, what we have is the prosecuting attorney there. So it's like the district attorney. The prosecuting attorney provides information on felony referrals, which is slightly different. But here's how you can find it. And all you get from this is a data dashboard screenshot. You can't download the data, right? So that's a little bit of a pain, which means all you end up with is a picture, but you can play with it a little bit online. I won't do King County because I think you're more interested in Spokane. Seattle's different. They give you a dashboard where you can actually download the data. So you get quarterly summaries of all the crime counts. So that's actually very good. Spokane, both the city and the county actually provide this information online. So you guys rock this way, right? The problem is they put it up as PDFs. That's a bit of a pain in the butt. You can't download the data. Spokane County, you'll see when we get to it, is everything except for Spokane City and a couple of others. So Spokane County Sheriff's Office makes these data available. And because Spokane City puts its own information up, Spokane County doesn't include Spokane City, which is actually kind of nice, because then you can see what the difference is between what's happening in the city and what's happening in the rest of the surrounding county. Tacoma also makes a complete incident-based download available to the public. Okay, so those are the 5 places I found to give us a peek at what's going on in 2021. So let's take a look at Seattle, just because I'm here. So Seattle, as I said, gives you a nice time series. It goes back all the way to 2008, so you can really see what's happening. And here are the quarterly crime counts. Notice that now we're actually talking about the count of crimes. It's not crimes per 1,000 persons because the population is changing over time here, and I don't have the time to go through and sort of fix all of that. So this is not adjusted for population growth. But basically what you want to look at for 2021 is after this black line, what's going on. And what you can see, again, it's going to be easiest to see this in terms of year-to-year changes. But one thing I'm going to point out, you're going to see that there's a big increase in aggravated assaults in Seattle, right, in 2021 relative to 2020. But if you look at the whole series, is that increase something new or unusual? No. Aggravated assaults have been rising in the city of Seattle since the year 2008, continually. So this change that we're going to see in 2021, that's just part of a long-term secular shift. That has, very little to do with anything that happened last year. Okay, so what do the year-to-year changes look like? Arson, there are practically no arson cases. Whenever you have small numbers, you have big percentage changes. So I just ignore this pretty much. You can see here, there was a small increase in arson, burglary went down, larceny went up, motor vehicle theft went up just a little bit. Violent crimes, assault went up, as you saw, homicides went down, rape went down, a tiny, tiny bit, robberies went up. So when you end up looking at the totals, basically you see property crime increased, violent crime looks like it increased, but homicides actually decreased by 25%. So you need to keep that in mind, and the total increase. So Jack, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, you mentioned a concept that I think gets thrown around a lot, but that a lot of people don't really understand necessarily, which is, you said when there are small numbers, you see big percentages, and so you ignore those numbers.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that and why we might not be concerned with big percentage changes sometimes?
Sure. So imagine, so in the arson case, that's a good example, actually. There are very few actual cases of arson. And let me see if I can find what that case count looks like. Oh yeah, actually I can show you in the tables. All of the tables behind these graphs are available, so you can look at them. So arson, actually, this has a reasonable number. Let me take a look at Spokane City because it's so much smaller, and let me find something smaller here. Homicides is actually the best, I think, case example, and that is in violent crimes. Okay, homicides. So in 2017, Spokane City had 5 homicides. So if you had a change then from say 2017 to 2018, let's say it was 5 additional homicides, that would be 100% increase. Seems huge, right? It's 5 additional cases. In Seattle, where we have way more homicides per year, let's actually see what we have. We have 30, right? An increase of 5 here would be, a 1 out of 6. So that's what, roughly 15% increase. Same number, an increase of 5, but in Spokane, that ends up being 100% increase. And in Seattle, that ends up being a 15% increase, okay? So whenever you have small numbers, let's say you have 1 or 2, and when we're talking, this matters a lot when you start talking about people killed by police, because those numbers tend to be fairly small. And when you break them down into communities like Spokane versus Seattle, you get very small numbers. And what that means is the year-to-year changes, the fluctuations, if you measure them in terms of percentage change, can be 100% up and 100% down. And it looks like huge things are happening when they're really not. It's really just that small numbers are more volatile. Do you think that answers the question?
I think so. Are there still trends that one can gain from small numbers over time?
Yeah, there's just a lot more uncertainty about them. But if you see them consistently from year to year, like over a 10-year period, every year they're growing by 2 or 3 or 4, and by the end of the 10-year period, you have this unbroken string of increases, yes, then you can say there's probably something going on there.
Thanks.
And if you're really interested in the answer, you end up taking a course in statistics, and then you find out how you quantify your uncertainty about these things. Okay, so let's take a look at Spokane City. So here are the case counts. Keeping in mind, again, we can only go back to 2017. And I'm going to give you a moment to look at this. This is also not adjusted for population changes. And you can see, here's 2020, the break point, and then we want to see what's happening in 2021. Do you see any huge increase in crime?
I see a slight uptick in larceny.
You do see the uptick, but look at it relative to 2 years ago. It's still lower than it was 2 years ago, right? So again, when you put these changes in context, sometimes you get a different perspective on them. So yes, there is an uptick in larceny, but a lot of other things are falling. And so let's actually take, if we want to focus in on exactly what those changes are, here's a classic example, that tiny little arson chart. And you got 141% increase. Notice this was in 2020, not 2021. It's not this year, right? But there was a big increase. Turned out, let's see how many total there were of arson. Hang on. That's in the table. What property? 59. Okay, right. So we went from 46 cases to 111. That's actually a fairly large jump, I would say, right? So this is one of those times where I would say, that's something I'd actually worry about. And then it kind of stayed there, right? 111 went to 107 the next year. So slight decrease, but not much of one, right? So something happened, but it wasn't in 2021. It was in 2020. So that's why it's good to see sort of the series before. All right, so let's get back to looking at so in terms of property crimes, you had last year, 4% decrease in arson, 4% decrease in commercial burglary, 37% increase in burglary of garages, 7% increase in residential burglaries, 11% increase in larceny, and a very small decline of 3% in vehicle theft. Okay, so a little bit of up and down in that category. What about violent crimes? Aggravated assaults, down. Aggravated assaults in domestic violence settings, down. Criminal homicides, up by 54%. But this is one of those cases where you went from 6 to 10, I think, in this is what I remember in terms of the numbers. So this is not a big jump in terms of overall cases. It's a small number effect. Rape cases are down by 14%. Commercial robbery, that's interesting. Oh, it's robbery. That's why. Okay, learning moment. I keep forgetting this. Burglary is when you burgle a building. Robbery is when you actually take something from a person. And so this is robbery in a commercial context and robbery in just a personal context. So commercial robberies are down by 25%, personal robberies up by 19%. And then total, if you want to look at over time, so property crime was up by 10% in Spokane City last year. And if you want to, again, you can go back to property crimes and see what's driving that, because there were some ups and some downs, right? Violent crimes were down by 9% in Spokane City last year, down. And the total, which was driven primarily by the property crimes, again, up by 8%. So the key thing here, I think, is you've had this narrative in Spokane City that crime is skyrocketing. The property crimes did go up by 10%, which is a typical sort of year-to-year variation, right? So I wouldn't get excited about that. And crime is not skyrocketing in terms of violent crime. Violent crime was down by 9%. Okay, what do we see in Spokane County? This will be the last thing that I talk about. Spokane County, it only gives you 2 years worth of data. It doesn't go back to 2017, which is unfortunate. So, and you have to grab the report at just the right time to get the end of year totals, which I was able to do. So what do we see? All we can look at is 2020 versus 2021. We can't go back any further. So I'm plotting this as a bar chart. Aggravated assaults are down, rapes are down a little bit, simple assault is down. So crimes against persons, I'm going to guess, is probably down. We've got fewer commercial burglaries, fewer garage burglaries, fewer residential burglaries. less, I mean, lots of downs here, right? I mean, there's only one place where it looks like, yeah, these are almost the same, but I don't see any increases in Spokane County. They all went down.
There's
So
a
if we,
slight increase on vehicle theft, which I'm just gonna,
oh, right, you are. Tiny increase, right, exactly. So let's take a look at what those look like. Right, and that's exactly right. So you had a 12% increase. Now, again, is that a lot? Well, in one sense, yes, because it follows years of decreases. But at some point, you're going to expect that decreases are probably going to level out or start having random variation, right? So, and it's only 12%, so I'm not going to get too excited because that's within my sort of thinking about, yeah, it's typical year-to-year variation. Crimes against persons, except for criminal homicide, this is based on 4 additional cases. Everything else declined, basically. So again, stepping back, there's a summary at the end of this that says, let's look across all of these jurisdictions at what we're seeing in changes in crime rates. So here's King County. I didn't show you that, but basically the felony referrals for King County are down, both for person or violent crimes and property crimes. Both of them are down in 2021. In Seattle, they're both up, but homicides actually declined by 25%. In Spokane City, you had a mix. The violent crimes were down, the property crimes were up. In Spokane County, they were both down, and in Tacoma, they were both up. So then, big picture, what do you see? It's a mix. That's what you see. You don't see that there's a huge increase in crime in these jurisdictions, which account for about 40% of the state's population. There's no overall increase in crime. In some jurisdictions, it's down, in others, it's up. In other jurisdictions, like Spokane City, there's a mix even within the city, right? So there's a mix. That's what you expect from year-to-year variation. You don't see a big increase. Okay, I'm going to shut up. I talked a lot longer than I should.
thank you very
I'm
much, Professor Morris.
happy to take any questions.
I'm going to prime the pump real quick, give people a chance to either raise their hand or put questions in chat. But I want to sort of take the facilitator's advantage and ask one question to start with while people maybe get their thoughts together. Before I head in, thanks for this whole overview. It's kind of nice to have somebody who can like walk you through the numbers and make them seem a little bit less scary. But there's something that you said at the very beginning, which was that talking about a crime increase isn't realistic because all the data isn't in yet.
Right.
But then we were at the end, you concluded saying, look, we know enough that there's a mix. So how do we know that we have enough data for our conclusion?
Right. That's a great question. And so what I'll say there is we have data for about 40% of the state. And what we can say there is there's a mix. So no matter what happens in the rest of the state, there's going to be a mix because there's a mix in this part, right? So I can't tell you what's going on in the rest of the state. It's possible, I think it's highly unlikely that crime increased everywhere else in the state. But what we can see in these major areas, and some of these are areas where representatives have consistently claimed there's been an increase in crime here. And Spokane is an example of that, right? Both your local elected representatives and your state representatives have been saying consistently there's a huge increase in crime. And Padden at one point, Senator Padden even said it's a huge increase in violent crime, which is in fact just the opposite of what's going on. So in some cases, we know enough to challenge what people are saying specifically about what's going on in their communities, if their community happens to be one that publishes the data. And I have to say, I was a little stunned to see Spokane being really one of the best in the state for making its data available to the public. It doesn't make it available in a way that's easy to work with, but it does make it available. And then for people to be claiming that there are these increases when all you have to do is look at the police department website or the sheriff's office website to see they're not. So they're counting on you not to look. And it's so easy to look.
So if I understand, if I can summarize your answer a little bit, what you're saying is statewide, with the data that we have, there's a mix. There isn't enough to say, to make the conclusion that there's any kind of increase based on the statewide data.
Right.
And that we can make some definitive conclusions about Spokane because we are one of the jurisdictions that does have all our data in.
That's right. That's exactly right. That was a great
Thank you.
summary. Yep.
All right, well, with that, this will end the recorded portion of this event. I want to thank everyone for sticking around. I want to thank you, Professor Martina Morris, for being here, walking us through this. I want to make one little announcement, which is that if you wanted to take action around this, you're saying, hey, look, I see now that it doesn't make sense for us to roll back what appear to be really effective police accountability laws, and I want to take action. PJALS is also putting together a legislative action hour tomorrow at 6 p.m. So you can come back there, and there's stuff on the on PJALS social media you can check out to get the links and whatnot. But that'll be a chance to act on this, and more will be coming in the future.